Hello, everyone. I hope you're having a peaceful day. Today, we're diving into a brutal turning point. James's father walks into the hospital with a contract that secretly says, if James leaves lie to Diep, her mother's life-saving surgery is free. If he stays, they owe everything. Will they confront him or give in? If this story grips you, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. The elevator doors slid open, and the last person Lai Tu Diep wanted to see stepped out as if he owned the entire floor. James's father. No warning, no phone call. Just that calm, polished man in an expensive suit, walking down the hospital corridor like it was another boardroom he planned to arrange to his liking. James saw him first. His fingers, which had been lightly resting on Diep's back, tensed. Nie, holding James's other hand, looked up, noticed the way everyone's face changed, and instinctively stepped closer to Diep. "Dad," James said, voice flat. "James," his father replied, eyes flicking over the bruise on his son's face. "So you did run back here?" He didn't ask how the surgery went. He didn't ask how Diep's mother was. His gaze slid past the ICU doors, past Nye, and landed squarely on Diep. "You look tired, Miss Lai," he said evenly. "I suppose that's what happens when you insist on carrying more than your life can bear." The words were smooth, but every syllable landed like a slap. Diep straightened her shoulders. "My mother just came out of major surgery," she said quietly. "If you're here to argue, can we not do it in this hallway?" A nurse looked up from her station, sensing the tension, then looked down again. Families nearby pretended not to listen while leaning just slightly closer. "I'm not here to argue," his father replied. "I'm here to make things clear, for everyone." He folded his hands behind his back, turning slightly so his voice carried to James as well. "I heard the surgery went well. You should be grateful, James. Not every woman your girlfriend's age gets such a generous intervention." Diep's stomach clenched. James took a step forward. "If you're talking about the hospital payment, I am," his father cut in. "The world is full of people who need help. I chose to help her mother. I did not have to. I did it because I care about my son's conscience, if not his judgment." He glanced at Diep again, gaze cool. "It must be a relief, Miss Lai, knowing your mother's life was saved by the man you keep accusing in secret." Diep felt heat climb up her neck. "I have never denied being grateful for the surgery money," she said, keeping her voice as calm as she could. "But gratitude doesn't erase what you did to my work, to my name." He arched a brow. "Your niche at the market?" The word came out like he was describing a hobby, not years of effort. "Some stalls close, others open. That's life. You cannot blame every difficulty on me simply because my company's name appears on administrative forms. The same company stamp closed my stall and paid my mother's hospital bill," Diep replied. "You moved money through the same account to erase me and to own me. That's not life. That's you." A murmur rippled through the nearby chairs. James's father's jaw tightened, only for a second before the mask slid back in place. "You're emotional," he said calmly. "Understandable. Your mother is ill. But let's be adults. My company has many accounts and many obligations. You are not the center of my financial universe, no matter how dramatic you make this." James couldn't stay quiet any longer. "Dad, stop," he snapped. "I saw the documents, the district office, the hospital forms. You didn't just happen to be involved. You targeted her niche. You targeted her. Then you hid behind charity." His father turned to him, eyes narrowing. "Is that what she told you?" he asked. That I am some villain in the shadows, sabotaging her little cake stand? He shook his head slowly. You disappoint me, James. All I have ever done is try to free you from limitation. I'm not limited by loving her, James shot back. I'm limited by your control. For a heartbeat, the older man's composure cracked. Control, he repeated, voice suddenly cold. Do you think wanting my son to marry into stability, to avoid a woman with debt, a sick parent, and a child who isn't even his? Stop right there, Diep said sharply. Even she was surprised at how steady her voice was. Nye sucked in a breath, eyes wide, instinctively hiding half behind Diep's leg. You do not talk about Nye like she's a burden on a spreadsheet, Diep went on. You do not talk about my mother's illness like it's a stain. You can hate me all you like, but you will not reduce the people I love to liabilities. James's father looked at Nye then, really looked, as if seeing her for the first time not as background, but as something inconveniently human. For a flicker of a second, something like discomfort passed through his eyes. Then it was gone. You are emotional, he repeated. So that is exactly why I did not want my son entangled here. Look at what your life is, James. Hospital corridors, uncertain income, drama. Do you think this is sustainable? Once your infatuation fades, you will blame her for everything you gave up. I'm not 17, James said, and I'm not infatuated. I know exactly what I feel, and I know what I've seen you do. His father sighed like a man carrying a heavy burden. I see there's no point in private talks anymore, so let me say this plainly. He pulled a folded envelope from his jacket and tapped it against his palm. Inside this are the documents for the hospital payment. It is structured as a company assistance package, with conditions. If you walk away from this relationship, James, the debt is considered forgiven, a cost of retaining a key employee. If you don't, he glanced at Diep, then the company has the right to pursue repayment, legally, with interest. Diep felt the blood drain from her face. Repay? 300 million? We don't have that kind of money. He looked almost sympathetic. Exactly. Which is why it is in everyone's interest for my son to think clearly. James stared at him in disbelief. You would use her mother's surgery as leverage? I would use my resources to correct my son's mistakes, his father replied. I told you before, James, everything has a cost. I refuse to subsidize your poor choices. You want this woman? Fine. Pay for her world yourself. Don't expect me to finance it. We never asked you to, Diep burst out. We never begged at your door. You walked into our lives. You moved things we didn't give you permission to touch. You made offers behind our backs and then called them generosity. Her voice broke. You think I don't lie awake at night knowing my mother's heartbeat might be tied to your signature? You think that makes me feel safe? For the first time, the older man looked unsettled, but his answer was still granite. Whether you feel safe doesn't change the reality. My son has a decision to make. Stay here, cling to this chaos, and learn what life looks like without my support. Or step back, let go, and I will consider the matter closed. He turned to leave, then paused, looking over his shoulder at James. You have until the final hospital bill is issued, he said. After that, the company has to decide how to categorize the expense. When he disappeared into the elevator, the silence he left behind rang louder than his words. Nye tugged at Diep's hand. Miss Diep, she whispered. Did we do something wrong? Diep knelt immediately, pulling her into a hug. No, baby, she said, voice thick. We didn't do anything wrong. Grown-ups sometimes do. James stared at the envelope in his hand, like it was a live grenade. I didn't know, he said again. I didn't know he would go this far. Diep straightened, eyes glossy but clear. This is who he is when someone tells him no, she said softly. Now you've really seen it. He nodded slowly, like a man realizing the ground he'd been standing on his whole life was actually ice that could crack at any moment. I need to read exactly what's in here, he said, lifting the envelope. And then I need to decide what kind of son and what kind of man I'm going to be. Diep's heart squeezed. James, I don't want your mother's life or mine to become a weapon between you two. I don't want that either, he replied. But he already made it one. The only thing left is whether we duck or stand up. Later that night, after checking on her mother again, they took Nye home. James carried her sleeping weight up the familiar stairs, laying her gently on the small bed with the faded cartoon sheets. He stood there for a long moment, watching her breathe. She deserves better than this, he murmured. Better than being a bargaining chip. Diep leaned against the door frame, exhaustion finally settling into her bones. So do you, she said quietly. So does my mother. So do I. He turned, eyes searching hers. I don't know how to fight him yet, he admitted. Every tool I have, he gave me. Job, connections, savings, even my degree. He built the road I'm on. She stepped closer. Then maybe it's time to build a different road. He smiled faintly, the bruise on his cheek dark under the soft light. With what? Courage and cake batter? Tenderness is harder to erase than money, she said. And I still know how to fry, even if I don't have a stall. For the first time that day, his laugh was real. Short, a little broken, but real. I don't deserve you, he said. She shook her head. That's not the question anymore, James. The question is, do we deserve a life that isn't built on someone else's threats? He looked down at the envelope again. Tomorrow, he said. We'll go to the hospital office, ask for copies, talk to someone who knows the law. I want to see if his leverage is as strong as he thinks, or just looks that way. And tonight? She asked. Tonight I stay, he replied. If your mother wakes up, I want her to see my face, and not his shadow. As she watched him sit on the edge of Nye's bed, gently smoothing the blanket over her shoulder, Diep felt something complicated and fierce rise inside her. Love, yes, but also a new kind of resolve. James was finally seeing his father clearly. The question was, when the full cost of standing up became real, would he still hold the line? Or would that envelope on the table slowly pull him back toward the world he'd just run away from? The answers hadn't come yet, but the storm, clearly, had only just begun. By the time the sky started to pale, James still hadn't really slept. He dozed for a few minutes at a time in the hard plastic chair by Nye's bed, jerking awake every time she shifted or sighed. In the next room, Diep's mother breathed steadily beneath a web of wires and soft hospital light. At some point, Diep came in with 2 cups of thin coffee, set one beside him, and didn't say anything. She didn't have to. The envelope on the table between them said enough. Today, James said quietly, staring at it, we find out exactly what he thinks he bought. Diep nodded. Before he turns this into a story where we're the ones who owe. The hospital administration office felt colder than the rest of the building. The air conditioning hummed too loud. Everything smelled faintly of toner and floor cleaner. A woman behind the glass partition looked up as they stepped in, her expression slipping from polite boredom to wary curiosity when she saw how tightly James was gripping the envelope. "Can I help you?" she asked. "Yes," James replied. "We'd like to see the paperwork for the financial assistance on patient Lai's surgery. I'm family." "Are you the sponsoring party?" she asked, already reaching for a folder. James's jaw tightened. "My father's company is." She rifled through a drawer, pulled out a thick file, and came around the counter with it. "You're not really supposed to take documents out," she started, "but you can look through them here." Diep and James sat side by side at a small table by the window. The morning light fell right across the pages, leaving every stamp and signature unforgivingly clear. There it was again. Workshop account, Than Jaya Wood and Son Co. But this time, it was attached to a full contract. Not just a small notation. 4 pages of clauses printed in dense legal language. James began to read aloud in a low voice, more for himself than for Diep. Corporate assistance granted as an advance linked to employee retention and conduct. His finger traced the lines. If the employee remains in good standing and adheres to company expectations, this amount may be reclassified as non-repayable support at the discretion of the board. Diep leaned closer. And if he doesn't? He flipped to the next paragraph. If the employee resigns, is terminated for cause, or engages in conduct that damages corporate reputation, the assistance will be treated as a loan payable in full, with interest, within 18 months. He stopped. The next line was underlined in blue ink. Any third party whose circumstances are directly tied to this assistance, hereafter referred to as associated beneficiary, may be named in collection proceedings if the company determines they have contributed to reputational damage or financial loss. Diep stared at the words. "Third party," she repeated. "Associated beneficiary. That's me, my mother." James rubbed his forehead. "He built a trap that looks like generosity," he said. "If I do what he wants, the loan disappears. If I don't, he gets to paint us as ungrateful and go after us for money he knows you could never repay." The administrator hovered nearby, pretending to arrange files while clearly listening. After a minute, she stepped closer, voice low. "Off record," she murmured. "I've seen this kind of structure a few times. It's unusual. Most company donations are clean grants, no strings. This one has a lot of strings." "Is it legal?" Diep asked. The woman hesitated. "It's not illegal," she said carefully. "But if it went to court, a good lawyer could argue it was coercive, especially if it's used to control personal relationships. Judges don't like family messes turned into contracts." James looked up sharply. "So he's counting on fear," he said. "On us being too scared of the process to ever question the terms." The woman gave the tiniest nod. "Most people are," she replied. "Hospitals don't get involved unless there are complaints. We just process what's signed." Diep swallowed. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for being honest." As they left the office, the file still open in James's hand, Diep felt like she was walking with a stone in her chest. Not just at the cruelty of the contract, but at how precise it was. James's father hadn't been acting on impulse. He'd sat down with someone, drawn this up, and had it stamped. All while she'd been boiling water at dawn and praying her mother would live. In the stairwell, James stopped and leaned against the railing. "I keep thinking there has to be a version of my father that isn't this," he said. "But every time I pull on the thread, more of this comes out. More planning, more calculation." "And at the same time," Diep said quietly, Without this ugly paper, my mother might not be here. He let his head drop back against the wall, eyes closed. That's the worst part, he admitted. He's forcing us to be grateful for the same hand that's choking us. Back in the room, Diep's mother was awake. Not fully, but enough that her eyes tracked them as they entered. Enough that she squeezed Diep's fingers and reached for James with her other hand. "You came," she whispered, voice thin but clear. James blinked fast. "Of course I did, Mom," he said, leaning close. "I'm sorry I wasn't here before." She studied his bruised face with a frown. "This looks worse than mine," she muttered. "What happened to you?" "Occupational hazard," he joked weakly. "I argued with a wall." Her gaze lingered, seeing more than he was saying. Then she looked between the two of them, at the way their shoulders touched without thinking, at the tightness around Diep's mouth. "You both look like you're carrying rocks," she said softly. "Is my surgery that bad?" "No," Diep rushed to say. "The doctor says you're doing well. We're just tired." Her mother's eyes softened. "Listen to me," she whispered. "When I married your father, his brothers said I was trouble, too poor, too opinionated, not good enough. He chose me anyway. For years, he paid the price with his family, but he never once made me feel like I was the bill." Tears pricked Diep's eyes. "Parents get scared," her mother went on. "We think we're protecting our children from pain. Sometimes we turn into the pain. I don't know what's happening with James's family, but I know this. Any love that has to stand on someone else's throat to stay standing isn't love. It's fear." James swallowed hard. "What if the fear wears my father's face?" he asked quietly. "Then you will have to decide whether you want his face in your mirror when you're old," her mother replied. That's all. It was a simple sentence, but it hooked into James's chest and stayed there. Later, at home, the world tried its best to be normal. Nye spread her homework books on the table and insisted James check every answer. "If you say good job, it counts more than the teacher," she explained with absolute seriousness. He smiled, something in him softening as he corrected a small subtraction mistake. "There," he said. "Now it's perfect." Diep chopped vegetables in the kitchen, listening to them. For a few minutes, the sound of Nye's giggles and James's gentle teasing wrapped around her like a blanket. The life they kept almost having. The one that kept slipping just out of reach. At dinner, Nye bowed her head. "Dear God," she mumbled, eyes squeezed shut. "Thank you for making Grandma's heart better, for bringing Uncle James back, and please make all the angry grown-up stuff go away. Amen." James choked on his water. Diep blinked back sudden tears. "Out of the mouths of babes," she muttered. After Nye fell asleep, hugging the corner of James's shirt like a security blanket, they sat on the balcony with 2 cups of tea growing cold between them. "What are you thinking?" Diep asked. "Gee, that I wish we were fighting about something small," James said. "Like who forgot to buy fish sauce, or which school Nye should go to. Normal fights. Fights that don't involve contracts and ultimatums." She sighed. "You read the whole document?" "Twice," he said. "There's a line in there about conduct affecting corporate reputation. If I stay with you and my father decides that makes him look weak, he can say I violated that clause. Then he comes after us for the full amount, plus interest. If I go back, toe the line, he writes it off as support. So if you love me," she summarized quietly, "we're in debt. If you leave me, we're off the hook." "In his math," James said, "not in mine." Her eyes found his in the dim light. What does your math say? He took a long breath. My math says that if I let him use my mother's life, your mother's life, and Nye's future as negotiating chips, I'll spend the next 30 years looking in the mirror and seeing him. And I can't do that. Not even if it makes everything easier. Diep's throat tightened. Easy doesn't always mean right, she said. But hard doesn't automatically mean holy either. We have to be smart, not just stubborn. He nodded. That's why tomorrow, before I answer him, I want to find someone who understands this better than we do. A lawyer. Maybe that cousin your aunt mentioned. The one who helped her neighbor with a land dispute. I don't want my father to be the only one who knows how this game is played. She stared at him for a long moment, then smiled. Small, but real. You're scarier when you're calm, she said. I think I like it. Just then, his phone buzzed on the table. One new message from his father. He opened it. A photo loaded. Him, Diep, and Nye walking out of the hospital that afternoon. Their backs turned, Nye's hand in his, Diep's hand lightly on his arm. Underneath, a single line. Every choice has witnesses. Don't forget who's watching. Diep's stomach dropped. He had someone taking pictures. Of course he did, James said quietly, anger simmering low. He wants me to feel like every step I take with you is being recorded in his ledger. Does it change anything? She asked. He stared at the photo for a long time. Then he set the phone down, screen up between them. Yes, he said at last. It changes how quickly we have to move. She waited. I'm going to meet him, James continued. Not to beg, not to negotiate my love like a contract clause. To tell him clearly that I'm not selling you out to pay his bill, and that if he wants to drag this into court, he can explain to a judge why he tied a woman's heart surgery to his son's love life. Diep's pulse hammered. You want to go alone? He met her gaze. Do you want to come? She thought of Nye asleep in the next room, of her mother tangled in wires at the hospital, of the red stamp in her notebook, of the photo on his screen. Yes, she said. If this is the day your father looks me in the eye and tells me I'm not good enough for his son, I want to be there to tell him I didn't ask for his approval. James's lips curved in a tired, proud smile. Tomorrow, then? Tomorrow, she agreed. They sat there a little longer, the city buzzing softly below, the tea gone cold, the weight of what waited for them pressing in from all sides. Neither of them knew if walking into that office would end with slammed doors, legal threats, or a fragile, unexpected crack in a hard man's armor. They only knew one thing for sure. This time, whatever happened, they'd be standing side by side, not hiding, not whispering, not letting someone else quietly write their ending for them. And somewhere between love and fear, between money and dignity, between father and son, a line was about to be drawn that none of them would ever be able to erase. James and Diep's fragile peace shatters when his father suddenly appears at the hospital. In front of everyone, he reminds them he paid for Diep's mother's heart surgery, and then reveals the catch, a contract from his company. If James walks away from Diep, the money becomes a gift. If he stays, it turns into a heavy debt they may be forced to repay, with Diep and her mother named as associated beneficiaries. Diep confronts him for sabotaging her niche and treating her family like liabilities. James, devastated, reads the contract himself and realizes his father deliberately used money as a weapon to control his choices. Between gratitude for her mother's life and rage at the manipulation, the couple leans on each other, decides to seek legal advice, and prepares to face his father together. Knowing tomorrow's meeting could change everything.